this is an excellent panel, and I think the topic around the retail apocalypse, when I looked at it, I was like, oh, okay, this is not a new topic, but that's the point. It doesn't change, it just changes on how we start looking at it. I've been in retail since my early 20s when I started a retail store. I worked for Adidas, and I've been involved in e-commerce entities and also launching a fashion line, a cosmetic brand, and a fashion magazine. And over the 15 years of doing that, the challenges are still pretty much the same. The nuances and how we approach and respond to these challenges are changing, and the consumer is changing and challenging. So on this theme of the retail apocalypse, we've got, just quickly, what Alistair, Cobus, Neil, and Talene. What I'm going to do is ask you briefly, 1 minute, to say, this is who I am, and this is why the retail apocalypse is so interesting to me. And ladies first.
Wow. Okay, I'm Talene. I head up convenience retail for Sasol. I've been there for 5 years in this role, and I've got 16 years of experience within retail and FMCG. My view on the retail apocalypse is a bit different. I believe that as an organization, you are either driving change or being driven by it. And with that being said, you're either on two spectrums of that. You're either on the retail revolution if you're driving it, or you're going to feel the effects of the retail apocalypse if you're being driven by it. And when we talk about the disruption within this environment, which is impacting this view of a renaissance or a revolution, you think about the digital disruption in two elements. One is the digital aspect, which is the how we're changing things. And when we're looking at the human element and the consumer side of it, it's why we're changing things. Why is the change necessary? And in order to understand the changes from the consumer point of view, I think it's been mentioned quite a few times earlier today, it's understanding the data, understanding your consumers' needs, their behaviors, their patterns, and predicting their behavior, basically. So from that point of view, I think that framing the data is just as important, because data without context serves no purpose. So with that being said, I think those are the key points from that point of view.
Thank you very much. I'm going to skip to Cobus, come to Neil, and then Alistair.
I've been in retail for 18 years, brick and mortar supermarket scenario. From there, I realized that the retail apocalypse is playing a big role, and if we don't change our mindset towards retail in a brick and mortar scenario, it will die. And I now facilitate retailers in assisting them to make that mind shift of removing friction towards the customer, because I believe that's the biggest problem, that we cause unnecessary friction towards our customer to come to us and support us. And then also bringing retail back to having an online presence in parallel with a brick and mortar store. That's it.
Thank you. I love that. Changing mindsets and is significant. It's critical, and moving friction away from the customer. I love that. Neil.
So I'm Neil. I used to be an academic across a bunch of economics and business schools, and about 3 years ago, with a couple of colleagues, we founded a startup to help organizations use their data better. So I'm interested in this sort of retail apocalypse, one from a kind of an intellectual space, because that's what I used to study, but also secondly, because this is what we do, is we help our customers, often the bricks and mortars guys, respond to some of these challenges that are coming from online and how they use their data, their platforms, to respond to this threat.
I like it. I thought once an academic, always an academic. I used to be an academic. Well, from one academic to another academic who has got a significant amount of experience in lobbying and e-commerce globally, Alistair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Indeed. I'm looking at the digital economy from the point of view of a holistic point of view. How is it being operated? What is the training behind it that's necessary? What is the research? We don't have that much research. And how can we improve that? And how can we encourage trust by consumers? And I'm looking at it not only from the South African point of view, but as I mentioned earlier, also I run the e-commerce forum Africa, which is really looking at how the African free trade area is going to impact on e-commerce cross-border. And as we know, as Marek said, that is one of the biggest problems. And yet, it's one of the biggest opportunities that we all have.
Yeah, indeed. And I know, Alistair, that part of that, and we look at a micro South Africa, and then we look at the rest of the continent, and we also tend to group these things. But the retail environment is very, very different. So I think we've got to appreciate that context. I know that we're making inputs into the African Union's digital economy strategy for the continent. It's a multi-stakeholder Pan-African team, but that is incredibly complex. We heard earlier how this cross-border trade is a significant challenge. It's easier to get goods from China than it is to move cross-border within Africa. So just moving on from that, and thank you, this concept of retail apocalypse, and what someone said to me the other day, Mall-ageddon, is real and very much in the context of South Africa, where we've got a big mall culture and we're still developing malls, yet we're seeing what they call this retail apocalypse, which was, the genesis for this was in the US with the closing down of significant shops and retailers. I think I saw the stat is over 6,000 odd stores were closing down 2019 in the US. Of course, there is the rise of other stores that are popping up, but the big span kind of stores are closing down. So South Africa, I read an interesting article just now, and I'm going to get into that, but let's look at the drivers that we see around this retail Armageddon. And for me, it is really a retail evolution, but what is driving it at its core? And I'm going to hop to academic number one, Neil, for the start on that.
So I think, obviously, online is driving it, isn't it? It's the access to many more brands, to many more products that than you used to. So, you don't have to go anywhere anymore. And so falling data costs, better supply, increasing, well, what's actually happening is, in a way, this long tail is, now you don't have to specifically go to your favorite hobby shop to get one thing, which is in a very sort of difficult place to get to. You can order from your couch. So those are the kinds of factors that are driving it. And I think as well, it's also being pushed by these technologies that places like Amazon, Facebook, those kind of organizations are almost making open source. So you can do a lot of the back end now through through mechanisms that were relatively cheaper than they were. So there's sort of falling costs as a sort of an online store, but there's also now many more clients that you previously had.
Okay, so fair enough. This is not a new response, and I think it is kind of what we are seeing. But let's really get down to the nitty-gritty here. Online retail, South Africa, 1.4% approximately. Strip out the travel, etc., and you're going below 1%. China, it's about 20% online. I don't know what it is when you strip that out. Germany, about 18% is online of their total retail. 11%, and the UK is 18%. That's a significant difference. So there we see the opportunity for it. But at the moment, retail Armageddon is not because of online. It's got to be some other factors that are there. Kobus, you talked about the customer.
Yes.
What is your view on how that might be driving it?
I believe that the friction that we internally cause in our brick and mortar way of, can you call it a cultural manner of doing retail in South Africa, the consumer has grown and is more educated in products, and so he knows exactly what he wants. He knows how he wants to get it. He knows he's done his research by the time he's made the decision to do a purchase. And I feel that the general retail's setup in a brick and mortar store, we're not catering for that customers. We treat them like they don't know what they want. So by removing all that friction of accepting what they want, accepting that they are making the decision, I believe we will not stem the trend, but at least adjust to be able to perform still in the market on a competitive level. A simple example of friction, and it's not maybe anything that you occur with every customer, is just a return policy, a simple return policy. Online, you can return anything with no questions asked. Anything normal, with any normal channel that you follow with a brick and mortar store, it is a 2-3 week, maybe sometimes even month process. So then that customer becomes reluctant to visit that retailer or a retailer because of that. It's just one example.
Okay, so it's the customer experience. Neil talked about the growth of online, how that is a factor. How we got to adjust to the customer's needs, so the experience and the customer experience, which we're going to talk about a bit more.
The experience
now.
is that's.
And that also, you talked about
thing.
returns, which is also convenience.
Yes.
And maybe I'm going to go to you, Talene, around the convenience, because I think what you're doing with Sasol and the convenience stores is quite a unique model. And given the topic and the drivers, what are you learning from what you're doing and how that's impacting the change?
I think there's definitely a need for hyper-convenience, which is on the border of on-demand, basically. People want items personalized when they come into store from a food point of view. You want them to have the options available to take out items, put items on, and make it unique to them. In terms of the customer experience, there's also still a need for digital to be incorporated into a seamless experience with futuristic thinking of pre-ordering and picking up in store. There's lots of trials in terms of the courier service offerings, with the post office also currently not being fully effective. You have that gap in the market for a place to fulfill shipment and these drop-off and collection points. So those are some of the opportunities that you would see in the industry at the moment from a convenience point of view, where people want to come in for a one-stop solution. They are going to be there, so why not get other items which are going to add to their convenience? And one of the things that I always say is that the currency of retail at the end of the day is customer experience. And sometimes we forget that there's also the foundational elements that we need to incorporate, like customer service and the quality, the refund process in an online option, or things like training your staff. Those are still foundational elements that still need to be focused on, especially if you're trying to grow within digital. People often lose focus of the basics.
So I love that. You talk about the one-stop solution, hyper-convenience, the click-and-collect opportunities. So moving around these opportunities to engage with the customer, make it easier. Yes. The experience beyond also then the brick-and-mortar store. So this is omni-channel.
Yes.
And Alice, this is very much a game that you play and talk. But what are the realities of this? We talk about omni-channel. What are the realities of the growth in this? And is it happening fast enough? And if so, why or why not?
Thank you. I started the whole session by talking about the fundamental, in my view, point that e-commerce is not just shop rooming or web rooming. It's a combination of the two. It's not just buying something online and then either click and collect or having it delivered. It's also the fact that the web site, your website or sites, are actually your shop windows. And in fact, even more relevant in a way than your shop window in a retail. And I think that's very important. So omni-retail, we have talked about this. I came into e-commerce having tried to set up a thing called the Omni-Retail Association here which is an international association here in South Africa. It was far too early to do that, and that was in 2015. I think it's still too early. I think people are still not quite understood and grasped what is the need for omni-retail and a holistic approach to marketing, to products, to the website, and also the shop window, etc., etc. So I think we still are grappling with that problem. Can I just ask a question of the audience? How many of you are from small e-shops? Is there anyone from a small e-shop? No. So most of you are either multinationals.
We're the multinationals in the room.
Well, Sasol is multinational. There are a number of multinationals, Black & Decker, various others. Or you are service providers who are servicing both small and large companies. So I think we need to be aware of what the small company needs, and in particular, the benefits that small company has in terms of using Shopify, WooCommerce, all these pre-made systems which provide customer service, etc., or at least guide the e-commerce shop into that. So we need to work on how we can bring these two separate organizations, as it were, multinationals and large companies, and also the SMEs, the small companies, the one-man and his dog operations.
Lovely. So we're talking about the ecosystem. And
Exactly.
How do we collaborate across that ecosystem? Neil, you were talking to me about a nice example. I mean, we talk about Armageddon, Maulegeddon, and the Amazon effect. And maybe if you don't mind, just sharing the little story or the case study around Armageddon, Amazon, and Nike.
Yeah, so, I mean, coming back to this, retail apocalypse theme and who it affects and how do you respond, I mean, a great way to think about it is what we saw with Nike and Amazon last year. So Nike went through a trial period where they would officially supply their products through Amazon. And at the end of last year, they decided that actually that wasn't going to be the case, and they would move to their own platform. And they can do that because obviously Nike is a very powerful brand. And they were pushing back against Amazon because they have to make this trade-off against sort of number of customers they can service, but the data that Amazon gets and the control that Amazon gets about suggesting and making recommendations and those types of things. So when I was talking to Dylan, I mean, that's a very interesting way to think about these things. Depending on who you are and what kind of brand power you have, it's a different path for someone like a Nike versus someone who's sort of has less of a well-developed brand. If you're starting out, you might have to start out on one of these aggregators or marketplaces.
So this data integration for me is critical. And Talene, you also mentioned, we talked about it, I know you've got experience working at Mr. Price, Edcon, etc. before your journey took you to Sasol. I've been running, so at Deloitte we have a connected retail concept store where we integrate all the latest technologies, and I've been taking through all the large retailers and FMCG companies through this recently. And one of the gaps that was identified was through the value chain, there isn't data integration or sharing or collaboration, generally. However, you're starting to see this change in the way that you're looking at your model, and how are you approaching that, and why is it changing?
I think people are seeing the need for the data integration. Within the convenience space, you have third-party distributors that deliver to our stores. We don't have control over that supply chain. The only way to get the control over the supply chain is to collaborate and find that integrated ecosystem with the distributor, with the manufacturers, and bring it all together. Forecasting will only be possible if you can have the production data, you have the distribution data, as well as the sales information to determine which products are performing well. And from that end, I think that there's a need for all parties that are involved in servicing a consumer to work together to get to that customer experience, because there's a front end, as we were talking about, to say that there's a front end experience at the customer experience, but everything that happens at the back end also just as importantly affects the front end of the customer experience with how we fulfill the orders. So that's where the integration and that connected retail concept comes in.
We actually did an exercise. commission from 3 big retailers, took their forecasting data around specific categories, SKUs for 6 months. We used their traditional forecasting methodology, which is linear regressions, and then you overlay that with actually individual gut feel. That's pretty much the demand planning process in a very basic nutshell. We took that, we saw the results of the demand planning over 3 months, but at the same time, we then integrated what we called external data that might not seem in your normal line of sight. But we used artificial intelligence, machine learning, to feed into that, and we went from a 70% accuracy up to 97% accuracy. And there's actually the CEO of Nike who predicts that he will not have a single human demand planner in the next 5 odd years. There'll be different types of jobs that will result, but it's all going to be driven by machines and artificial intelligence. And I wonder, maybe, Kobus, and this is a little bit of a challenging question, but you're talking about the brick and mortar. How do we integrate technologies into the customer experience that links online and offline? So that consistency and how we're driving this change.
Yeah, it's a very complex question you're asking, and I think if you get that home run, then that would be the next step to take. But the market is moving towards solutions like that. As long as it caters to the customer's current needs, you need to use your data to identify those needs and design your technology around giving the customer the satisfaction that he requires before he walks into the store. And we've seen companies popping up with pads all over the store, data capturing basically scenarios, and then that data just sits and doesn't get utilized properly. It doesn't get mined properly. So I think that's where the lacking is in retail, because the retailers don't have that understanding of utilizing the data to satisfy the customer. And the research that's lacking is to get that knowledge crossed over to the retailers.
So it's that concept, have data, what now?
What now?
It's very, very true. Here, the big FMCG players, who here has data integration across all the silos within your organization? Okay, so this is a real issue, but it's an opportunity, and it's the legacy systems. And perhaps this is also what's driving this concept of retail Armageddon, is the new players that are essentially eating the lunch of traditional role players. They're not even sitting in their traditional competitive landscape. They're sitting somewhere else. Banks are becoming retailers. Retailers have the opportunity to become banks. Rise of these small, pure-play online organizations that are going simply into data as a player, and they're looking at how we actually use the data, not how do I only collect it, but how to actually translate that into actionable insights. Alistair, on that, and we're going to go to the audience after this for some questions, so do prepare some if you would like to pose anything. What then is, or where are you seeing the growth of digital retail? So we do talk generically about this, all of us. Is this in a specific segment? Is it everywhere? And what does it mean for South Africa?
Firstly, it's obviously, and we've talked about it throughout this conference so far, business to consumer. Business to consumer in nearly every form, including particularly in services like tourism, etc., 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 is an enormous growth here and throughout the whole world. Where I think we are missing is in business to business. And I think we're missing that, and that will be, as I mentioned before, a serious problem for South Africa when the African Free Trade Area eventually appears. We need to gear up for that now. Look at the East African community. Only 8 countries, but they have created a customs union which actually works. And so you can send something from Nairobi to Kigali, for example, in 24 hours, going through customs, which used to take nearly a week. Here we still have not got that, and we need to work on it. But business to business is going to be the real business of the future. And service providers, whether it's customer experience is extremely important in business to business, because you're selling a very much larger amount of things to one person, and you want to make sure that that person is very happy with your service. Or whether it's in logistics or whether it's in anything else. This is the elephant in the room. Never talked about, but actually extremely important.
Yeah, the elephant in the room is the B2B. We talk B2C all the time. I think there was a report that came out 2017, valued B2B e-commerce in Africa at about 83 billion. Again, it depends how you measure that. We keep talking about manufacturing led, so the reindustrialization, South African industrialization of Africa for economic growth, with absolutely we have to look at that. But there we talk about the multiplier effect. So in manufacturing, you look at a 4 times multiplier in terms of creating a manufacturing facility, what it impacts down the line, job creation, adjacencies, etc. We still haven't got that in the digital sphere, and I think there's significant opportunity to change the narrative around that.
It's economies of scale.
Economies of scale. So I suppose on this, and continuing on this conversation, Neil, I want to come to you. There's something that I think is quite interesting. And I mean, you've obviously got a lot of experience and depth of insight in looking at this market. But a lot of people come to me and the retailers, etc., and say, which technology should we be looking at? Like, that's kind of panacea, which we know is not true. But what are some of the top technologies or areas we should be looking at?
So, I mean, this is a great question. And I think particularly in this sort of world where we've been hearing about things like AI and machine learning, people are kind of fixated on those shiny things. But I think the top technology is basically just getting your house in order in terms of the data and the architecture that is required. Because you need to set those foundations. And your insights are going to be built on the data you collect. So, garbage in, garbage out. Or you ask the question about silos in the business and data not talking to each other across the silos. I mean, those are the big problems. So, the new world where we're leveraging data requires decent data, and just about every organization has got some kind of decent data, but it requires it in an environment that is usable. And the more data you have, and if you can put the data together across the silos, the more leverage and your insights and your ability to act grow exponentially.
So that's systems architecture, organizational design, etc. I mean, that's pretty much why companies like us exist. So it's not a tech solution, or you might integrate artificial learning, predictive analytics, all that into there. But maybe, and Kobus, maybe from your view, what have you seen as some technology to look out for? You're seeing how it's influencing the game.
Yeah, the convenience market for us is trending towards a self-help scenario. So it's a quick in, quick out. There must be no friction whatsoever. There is still a customer out there that wants the human interaction and prefers the human interaction. But the trend in the market I'm moving is looking at a self-payment, self-help scenario. And that's where technology plays a big role at the end of the day. In that retail side.
I wonder, maybe, Talene, building on that from a convenience aspect and what you're looking at, is there something that you are looking at that could change the game? And the game can be changing either from a customer experience perspective, a margin play, ecosystem development. What do you say?
I think what I can say is that we need to watch the space. There is something that we are working on. If we can get it approved, with the corporate timeframes, if it gets approved, it would be a first for South Africa and possibly a global first. So I can't say just watch the space, but with that being said, mobile payments has been there for quite a while within the convenience space. The trick has always been getting it into the fuels aspect. You have the forecourt attendance, which is not seen globally because individuals fill up their vehicles on their own. So that gap and filling that barrier in terms of that payment option is where the trick comes in. So with digital aspects, there's a lot of digital that can come in various aspects, even on the food space. As I mentioned earlier, we also in the food game because we're competing for that share of tummy. And we have to make sure that we're just as innovative, the quality of your products and the consistency is there. Even if it's within a franchise model, you have to put in the parameters to ensure that there's consistency.
So every organization
Yes.
should look at themselves as a digital organization. There's digital integration, and now I am a digital organization. It's customer experience, it's putting data first. But with that comes also the risk when we're talking about the data side of things and technology is data integrity and the risks that are there. And Alistair's been working on some stuff around Poppy and that. Alistair, what are you seeing in the trend in how we can now manage this data? So now we have the data, now what we start using it, how do we use it ethically and effectively?
As you all hear, I'm not South African. I came here from Europe, and I am a privacy expert. I've been working in privacy issues for over 25 years, which is why I've got white hair and a long beard. I don't know how many of you read an interview by the chairman of the information regulator. She did yesterday. She has gone to the president to ask that the POPE should be implemented by April. Obviously, she thinks that she's going to get somewhere, because otherwise she wouldn't have done a press conference on it. When we talk about preparation, we have to take into consideration the regulations around it, and particularly the POPE. Two things to say. Firstly, there are a lot of people who say that POPE is based on opt-in. In other words, you have to have the specific opt-in of your customers, and that would destroy most databases, in fact. That's the bad news. Unfortunately, for those people who say that, who are mainly lawyers, they haven't read POPE. POPE actually allows you to do marketing, to approach people who are your customers, or obviously your clients' customers. So if you have collected, as Sasol, for example, information on your customers, they have given you the opt-in. The only thing you have to do, though, is to make sure that they always have the right to opt out. So it's quite simple. But you will find lawyers who, unfortunately, have an inability to read, or perhaps think that they can frighten people into being their clients. And that is rather annoying. So I think we have to be aware, very aware of POPE, but we have to work within the rules of POPE. And that's where organizations such as the E-Commerce Forum South Africa play a very important role to represent the sector with the regulator and also to help the sector to be prepared.
This is really important because we are looking at data at every aspect of the client journey. And that is from what we call the front-end architecture, so the client experience, all the way to the back-end architecture, so the entire ecosystem. And we're collecting this data, we want to collect this data. How do we use it? What are the risks? South Africa is seen as one of the highest risk places for hacking, cybersecurity. It is also, Africa's got some of the most advanced organizations in the world when it comes to cyber hacking, etc. Yet, the surveys that have been done, and we've looked at with CEOs, still seeing it as fairly low down on the priority list when it comes to risk management within organizations. So this is something to really consider, especially for the big organizations. I know you're looking at them, but the growth of a pure retail organization has to take that into consideration because it can really kill your business. There is one thing, though. We're talking about the retail apocalypse, and what we're really talking about is where it's evolving to. We're talking about the evolution, the factors that are driving some of the change and how we need to adjust to this to survive. We're talking about technology, data, rise of e-commerce, the need for omni-channel, how convenience is driving that, how the relationship partnerships are driving those changes in the aspect of where consumers shop and decide to shop. So that's very much the front end, where we're going, and we're going to see that evolving. But why in South Africa do we have this retail apocalypse concept? And an interesting article I read by Alan Knott Craig, and he talks to the shopping mall ecosystem. This is not something we talk about. What is driving that? Why are we still having malls being built on a regular basis, but they're not being filled? What drives that? Is it the property fund managers? Are there property fund managers here? Anyone in construction? Anyone in shopping malls? Okay, so this is a significant amount of the investment in the country is put into the development of these. But it's not looking then at the front end. So this is the danger, the debt challenge that we have in South Africa. So the debt challenge is not only driven from a consumer perspective, but also from a business perspective, and how we constantly have to try and get out of that. So this is the brick and mortar experience. We've got to change. We've got to relook the formats. I think this is going to be an interesting journey when you see over the next 10 years how we respond to this. Are we going to have malls that are now being used as multi-use areas, so not just shopping centers, education centers, play areas, sports areas? This is going to start changing the entire game of how we think about what a mall is there to do and how it exists and how we interact with that mall. And I think that was very, very interesting, because I find myself also talking and thinking this end of it, but forgetting about how that drives a lot of the finance and investment in the country. So, to end, what I'd like to ask you is, looking forward, we're trying to find that golden thread. If you could tell future self to invest in the retail evolution, where would you say you should go and invest? And I'm going to start with Alistair.
I would come back to this question of B2B. I think investing in a platform, for example, which is B2B and is Pan-African, would be my best bet. I think that would be the next black unicorn. Jumea screwed it up royally, but I think a B2B platform, anyone who wants to start one, please come to me. I'll give you my last 5 rand, please.
Okay, B2B Pan-African platform. Kobus.
To invest. If you had the knowledge before, then it would have been easy. But the note I would leave is invest in the ability to embrace the change that online is bringing to brick and mortar. Invest in the ability to gather the data and use that data. That's the thing.
Okay, so data mechanisms,
yeah.
Fantastic. Great idea.
I think 2 areas. One, I think the infrastructure that's going to drive this. So, we've seen Stripe and payment infrastructure, Shopify and marketplaces, Merrick and RTB House and their ideas. So I think there's going to be a huge infrastructure. We need infrastructure to build these new stores. So I think that's going to be important. And then I think the second place is what this world opens up is a lot of niche players. So, if you're a smaller niche player, you can now specialize and compete against some of these big guys. And if you don't want to be too rich, but you can find an area there, I think that's going to be successful.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
I think companies would need to invest in developing a long-term customer strategy with the digital journey incorporated into it as an element. We've spoken a lot about data, and the reason data is so important is to understand the consumer, because they're evolving, and we want to predict what's their next move. So my view on that is who is actually disrupting this environment? Is it the customer or is it the digital environment? And from that point, that's where the customer strategy comes in so importantly into developing that. And the digital element is important for that journey because you need to define what digital is for your organization. We've been through that. Digital to one person may be automating an Excel spreadsheet, where to another person it's drone deliveries and things like that. And from that aspect, you'd also have to understand that we're working with a lot of companies that have legacy systems that need to be upgraded. So that digital strategy that informs the consumer strategy is quite important, and that's where I'd like to leave it.
So that's very interesting, and thank you. And I like what you said. So who is disrupting
Yes.
the environment? And I think there are a number of players. I wrote an article a few years ago, and it talked about the traditional retail value chain: those who produce, those who distribute, those who retail, and those who consume. And that is a traditional linear process. Now that is completely being disrupted. FMCG players are trying to go direct to consumer. The retail FMCG relationship is being challenged. And again, it's margin play. Producers are saying, well, hang on, I want to get more of margin, so I can produce and then also distribute. Logistics becoming a service, something that you guys are looking at. We're seeing how data is being played across that entire field, but who owns the data and who owns the customer? Before we used to compete for customer in the shopping aisle. Now we're competing for customer everywhere. And that is driving this whole change. But then again, we're going, hang on, that's driven by the customer and not by us. So we've got to respond to what the customer needs are. So retail apocalypse, hype or reality, certainly is hype, but it certainly is also a reality. I think we've agreed that it is a retail evolution. It's constantly going to be changing. These same challenges will probably be topics in 10, 15 years' time, but how we're responding to them is going to be different. And I think this is what makes it so exciting. We mentioned when we were talking, you really got to be a special kind of person to be in the retail field, and you either love it or you don't. And clearly, we all love it, and I take it everyone here does, because it's a fast pace of change, and I think it's a significant opportunity for us. We do have challenges, though, in South Africa with our dynamic, diverse consumer, with the debt crisis that we have, economic instability that are perhaps suppressing this evolution that we are talking about. However, pockets of opportunity are there, and there's opportunities to invest and ensure that we not only as businesses making money, but consumers seeing the benefit going forward. So thank you very much. Thank you, panel.